Hello and welcome to today's Opto webinar where I'll be discussing recipes in PAC Display. I'm glad you could join me. My name is Alexi Beck-Gray. And before I get started, I'd like to review a few housekeeping items and let you know how you can participate in today's Opto webinar event. On the left-hand side of your screen, you'll see the viewer window where you'll watch the presentation. You can always resize that by clicking and dragging the lower right-hand corner of your viewer window. Now, in the upper right-hand corner of your screen is a control panel, and you might need to click on the orange arrow to expand it or minimize it if you'd like to. And at the bottom of that little grab tab, we call it, there's a hand icon. If you would, go ahead and click on that hand icon. What that will do is if I see those hands, I'll know that you can hear me. Excellent. You guys are pros. I see some veteran Opto webinar attendees, so you guys know how this works. Also in your control panel, you have an audio pane with information. It looks like most of you are connected over VoIP. One or two people are calling in. If for some reason your network slows down, you can always dial in using that audio information and connect through your phone. Otherwise, you can relax and listen to the presentation knowing this is coming through your speakers. Also, in your control panel, you have a question box. This is the way you can communicate with us and ask questions. I tend to get rolling in the presentation, and I probably won't notice the questions until the end, but at the end, I promise you will have plenty of time to go through your questions, and I'll try to cover as many as I can in the time allowed. So anytime you have a question, feel free to enter it at that time, and then I will, again, address those questions near the end of the presentation. So I'll go ahead and lower your hands. And now we're going to talk about recipes in PAC Display. And that's what we're here for. I guess the first question that we should address is what exactly is a recipe? And that would be a good question. And essentially, it's just an ASCII text file, like the one shown here on the right-hand side of your screen. Again, if that's covered up on your presentation, you can click on that orange arrow, and that'll scoot that control panel over so you can see the full screen. Now, a recipe can be used to download data to a SNAP PAC control engine, like a PAC-S or a PAC-R controller. And additionally, they can even issue chart control instructions. In the example of the recipe file I've shown here, the recipe is used to initialize 4 set points in a table. Let me highlight that portion with my spotlight. So I'm initializing 4 elements in a table, and then I am also stopping the fuel monitor chart with this instruction. And finally, I'm initializing a single variable as well. This is something new in PAC Display 9. Previous versions, you could only write to tables. Now you can write to individual variables, so that makes things a little bit convenient. And in addition, recipes can be used to upload data from a SNAP PAC controller to a PC that's running PAC Display. And you might use a recipe upload to save critical process settings. By saving those settings to a recipe file, you could then download that recipe file to restore these settings or values after a system failure, for example, or after you've upgraded your firmware. That wipes out persistent variables, for example. Using recipes, you can restore them. So it's a great tool with very practical applications in the real world. So today in this demo, we're going to start with the recipe editor in PAC Display. With older versions of PAC Display, you had to actually create a text file using Word or Notepad, and you had to hope you got the syntax exactly right. We've made it easier with a recipe editor that builds your recipe files for you, which greatly speeds up development and it minimizes errors. I'll show you how to create a recipe download file, and that file will contain all the new data, values, and any chart control commands that you want to send to a PAC control strategy running in a PAC controller. We'll also create a recipe upload template. This template file specifies what data you want to record or store in a file on your PC. And I'll also show you some of the various ways that you can trigger these recipes. There are 2 main ways. You can either animate a graphic or you can do a trigger. So you have a few options. One thing I'm curious about, I would like to do, is I'm curious why you're here for this particular webinar. It'd be fun for me to know. Go ahead and select. I think I meant to have it check all that apply, but it looks like it's only going to select one. So go ahead and choose a few options for you. I'll give you another minute to select a vote. Just kind of fun. Okay, it's good to know that so far nobody thought this was going to be sharing any cookie recipes, so that's excellent. Okay, I'll go ahead and close the poll, and I'll just share the results, and you can see that most of you do want to use recipes, but you're not sure how. So let's go ahead and get to that, and I'm going to bring up then PAC Display. So second here. All right, so you should see my PAC Display screens, as well as I do have PAC Control. I may need to reference that a little bit as we go along. Okay, so starting off in PAC Display, for the first demonstration, we're going to create a recipe download. And we're going to use that built-in editor that I talked about just a moment ago. To find that editor, we go to the Tools menu, and we select Create Recipe File. Now, as I said, we're going to use this file to send data, to initialize tables, maybe stop and start charts. We're going to send that down to the controller, so we're going to choose the download option. Okay, then we select which recipe. Now, my particular PAC Display project is only talking to one strategy, so that's the only one listed there. And I'm also, of course, then only talking to one controller, so I've got that listed here automatically as well. Let's start with my set points table. The recipe file editor automatically will bring in any tables that I have in my strategy. I happen to have only 3 tables. And I'm going to choose this floating point table for set points. So I'll click on this arrow button here. And it automatically displays the correct amount of indices that I have in that table. So when I configured this table, I made it a length of 20. So it shows me indices 0 through 19. And I can then specify the data that I want to send to my table in PAC Control. So maybe index 0 I'm not going to use. I can put a comment there. Then my first set point might want to be 85, and I could make a note that that's going to be the set point for PID 0. Maybe index 2, that's going to be used for PID 2 set point. Okay, and I could continue on entering the data that I want to send to initialize these tables. You can also select multiple indices using the Shift or Control keys. So I'll just Shift-click and select a group of tables. And I can then configure multiple entries at once. So if I'm sending the same value, I could put in 75, and that value gets applied to all of those. Okay. So once I've entered all of the data that I want to, and optionally, any comments, I'll click OK. Now, with this tool, you can only enter one set of indices for each table in the recipe file. If you later want to enter another portion of the table later in the recipe, you'll have to use a text editor to do that. So you can only have one entry over here for each table using this editor. So you see, kind of get an idea of what the recipe file is going to look like. It has the controller name, the type of data, the name of the table, and then the values that we're going to send. Okay, we can add to this. We're going to configure the recipe to start a chart in our strategy. So I'll select the chart, and it automatically lists all of the charts that I have in my strategy. I'm going to choose my init data chart, and I'll click the arrow button. And I can choose to start, stop, suspend, or continue the chart. I'm going to actually start it. And so that gets added to my recipe file. Now, as I mentioned earlier, previous versions of PAC Display only had those two options, but starting with 9.0, you can now choose to write to individual variables, and they can be numeric or they can be string. I'm going to choose numeric, and I'm going to write to this init PID data flag because I've got some logic in my chart that waits for that flag to be set before it actually initializes the set point. So I am going to select that option, and I'll choose to enter a value of 1 to set that flag true. Okay. Now, I did these objects all in order. Let me grab my little spotlight. I entered the table, then I chose a chart, then I chose a variable. You don't need to do it that way. You can add multiple tables. I can then come back and choose to stop another chart. Maybe I'll stop my fuel monitor chart. So I can choose that action and add to my recipe. Okay. If I need to undo something, I can simply click the undo button or redo to put it back. All right, that's enough, I think, for this demonstration. So I'll click OK. And of course, I need to save this. So by default, it puts me in the directory that I've been working in with my PAC Display project. And I'm simply going to call this new data. And it saves it as a .rcp. That's our recipe file format. And I'll click Save. Now, if I need to make any changes, I can simply go back to Tools and Edit Recipe File. I can then browse for that recipe. I just created that new data recipe, and it was a download recipe file. And then I can come back and edit it if I want to. I don't need to do anything here, though, so I'll click Cancel. Now, we used the editor, and it's pretty foolproof. If you had used a text editor to do this, you might want to play it safe and take advantage of another option. If you go to Tools, you can choose to validate a recipe file. This utility validates the file by checking a variety of things, such as whether the lines are properly formatted, if the control engine named in the file is part of the current PAC Display project, if the strategy file can be opened, if things are spelled correctly, if the indices are in range for a given table, that kind of thing. So let's choose to validate a file. Maybe we'll select the one that we just created, which was new data, and we see that it was successfully parsed. I would expect that, so that's good. Let me try another one that I created called bad data. Maybe it's a bad recipe file. And it had some errors. I see that I've got an invalid table index. I think my table only had 20 elements, and I tried to index 41. I listed a controller that doesn't exist, and I had a line format. So if you see errors, you can simply edit it right from here by clicking on the Edit Recipe File option. So if I do that, it just launches that recipe file in Notepad, and I could make changes. So for example, I had a bad index 41. Maybe I make that 11, put a PAC S controller, and I think I need to put a comment. Let's see if I got all of those changes. I'll save that file, and I'll retest the file, and I fixed it. So that can be useful if you're making some edits. Because I could see how once you get the syntax, it might be easier actually to do it in Notepad to enter some of the data. But that's up to you. And let's click OK there. So we've got our file of data that we want to send down. And the question now is, well, what determines when that data or that recipe is sent down to the controller? Well, you can configure a recipe to download or also to upload in one of two ways. One option is to have a button in PAC Display. And when the operator clicks on that button or graphic, then the recipe is downloaded. The second option is to configure a trigger. The trigger is associated with a tag in PAC control. And when that tag meets a defined value, such as a point turns on or something gets to a certain state, then the recipe action will be triggered, and it will do its upload or download. So for demonstration purposes, let's start with the first option, an animated graphic. I placed a button here using the new tool or the new button feature that's available in PAC Display 9. So I created a nice looking button. And we'll double click on it just like we do to program a button in PAC Display. And under the operator-driven attributes, I'll choose Download Recipe. Okay, so filling in the blanks, the first thing we need to do is tell PAC Display where the recipe file is located, or it's the working directory. And I found the directory. It's in the same directory as my project, so that made it easy. Now I have a choice. I can choose a fixed name if I always want to, by clicking on that button, download the same data. But maybe I want to let the operator choose what data I'm going to send. For example, on a batch process, I might be choosing to download the recipe file to make chocolate chip cookies versus the recipe file to make oatmeal raisin cookies, or to initialize the values that I need to test solid-state relays at one rating versus the values I need to test another batch of solid-state relays. So you have that flexibility there. Let's choose the prompt for name so the operator can choose what specific data they want to send down. All right, so we'll choose prompt for name, and that's all we need to do. I'll click OK, and we're going to test it out by going to File, Save Project, and Load Runtime. Okay. So I'll go ahead and close this screen. Now, what we're looking at here, just as a review, I have a PID loop with initially it's a set point of 70. The recipe is going to write to this table that we have displayed down here. And it's also, my strategy then is going to take it from index 1 and write it to my PID set point. So we should see the values change. On my graph, the set point is in yellow. So I'll go ahead and click the button. And remember, we chose let the user select which file they want. So I'll select the new data file. Okay, and it downloaded the recipe. I can tell that because I filled up my table, the 85, the 83, and all of those 75 values. And then in my PAC control strategy, I said get the value at index 1 and write that to my set point. So that's what happened. I can see in my trend, my set point jumped up to 85, and of course now my PID is trying to control the temperature there. Okay, so that seemed to work pretty well. I can reset those values back to the way I had them. I'm going to just click download another recipe that I configured. That time, you'll notice maybe, if you saw it, that it didn't ask me for which recipe. I preloaded, said just do the reset button to reset my values back to what they were. Okay, so just a slightly different option. Okay, and also we wanted to verify, might as well show you this. I had the fuel monitor chart stop. So if I bring up PAC control and look at my list of charts, oh, I must have deleted that, but my init data had been running and it stopped. But now what I'd like to show you is the other method for initiating a recipe download. Okay, so we showed the first option, which is have a button to trigger the download. The second one is to have a trigger based on an event or a value of a tag. So to do this, we need to be in PAC Display Configurator. And we'll go to the Configure menu and choose Recipes. This is the Recipe Manager. And we're working with downloads, so we're going to add a downloaded recipe. And I'll name this New Set Points. Just give it a name because we could have multiple situations, multiple data that we wanted to initialize. And excuse me. I'll choose the Browse, select the directory. Excuse me there. So I've selected the directory that my recipe file is in, of course. And this time, we'll just do a fixed name. This is the option I did on that second button. And I'll just enter the name of my recipe, keeping the extension RCP. Okay, so I've specified the file, but not the trigger. So we're going to specify that here by clicking on the trigger button. For this example, I'm going to wait until a switch is turned on my load panel. So I'll browse for that tag by clicking on the tag selection button. And that's going to be, I want to set up a discrete point, so I'll choose that first and select my digital input point, the photosensor. And those of you that have been for training, you'll know that I tend to use the same I/O just for convenience, but it's a switch on my load panel, and I will say that when the point is on, that will trigger the download. So we've got on selected here, and I'll click OK. So that's the trigger. There's one more option. It's a notification, and it is, well, optional. You can have PAC Display assign a value to a tag when a recipe has successfully downloaded. So, for example, if we want an alarm to sound when it's completed the recipe download, we could do that. So to configure that, we'll click on Notification, and I'll select the tag. Oops, once again, I forget to set up by discrete. So now I'll select the tag, choose a digital output point, and we'll sound the alarm. Maybe you'll be able to hear that. And in this case, we'll set the alarm. Okay, so that will turn it on once the download is complete. Okay, so that's configured. Let's go try it out. We'll go to File, Save Project, and Load Runtime. I'll close my event log viewer and watch the same data. It's going to write the same data this button did. The table should change. So I'll click on my photo sensor button to turn it on, and maybe you can hear that the alarm turned on. And we see here on the screen that the recipe file was loaded. Okay, I'll turn the alarm off. And we'll see we did get new data. We got our new PID set point. All it was based on a trigger. Okay, so triggers and buttons that you can use to do a recipe download. So that covers recipe downloads, which are a way of sending data to initialize variables or to issue chart commands, stop and start a chart. And often they go hand in hand. You might want to stop a chart, initialize data associated with that chart, and then restart or continue the chart that was using that data. Okay. So now let's talk about recipe uploads, which is taking data from the controller and storing it on our PC that's running PAC Display. And let me give you a real-world example of why you might want to use a recipe upload. Let's say you've got a bunch of persistent variables in your PAC control strategy. Now, those of you familiar with Opto know that persistent variables are very useful because these persistent variables retain their current value, even if you lose power to your controller, even if you re-download the strategy. So if you've got things like PID set points or your PID tuning parameters that you got just right, or maybe you're keeping track of an accumulated count, such as how many widgets you've made. You don't want to lose those values just because you update your strategy or just because you want to update the firmware. Maybe you want to go up to the 8.5 firmware so that you can run PAC Project 9 and take advantage of some of these cool features. Well, when you update firmware in your controller, you lose the persistent variable values. They get reset back to 0. So rather than blowing those away, especially if you have a lot of them, it would be helpful to store the current values of those persistent variables using a recipe. So you upload those values, you retain them, you store them in a file, and then after you've updated your firmware, you can then restore those initial values with a recipe download. Okay, so it's very cool, it's very practical, and let's see how it's done. To do a recipe upload, you need a recipe upload template. And what the template is, as the name implies, it's telling PAC Display what data to get from PAC Control. Okay, so we're going to use our recipe editor once again, which we'll find under the Tools menu, and we'll create a recipe file. And this time, we'll choose Upload. Okay. We've got our same strategy, the same controller. Now, in the description, I mentioned persistent variables. If I bring up my PAC control strategy for you, you'll see hopefully, let me grab my little spotlight. You'll see that I have two persistent variables here. The icons are a little bit different color, and I put a P at the beginning there to indicate that they're persistent. So these are two values that I want to record. They're the regular low limit and the premium low limit. So that's some data that I want to put in my recipe template. Okay. So going back to my recipe file editor, I'm going to go right to choosing my variable type. And I'll choose numeric variables. And then I get a list of all of the numeric variables in my strategy. And I'll choose the regular low limit and add that. I can put a comment if I want to. And I can keep going and choose now my premium persistent variable. Okay. So I could go through in this process choosing all of my persistent variables. Here's where having that P at the beginning would help speed up this process if they're all grouped together. And of course, you could have persistent tables as well, and you could select that data. Maybe I want to record this integer table. I can select that table. For a recipe template, we need to say what indices of the table do we want to log. So I can select all of them and get the entire table. And once again, PAC Display automatically knows the length of the table and puts that in there for you. So you don't have to remember how big that table was. Now, if you change the table size, you may need to first save your program, save your project in PAC Display, maybe even close it and reopen it for the editor to update if you're doing changes back and forth simultaneously to the two programs. But PAC Display does know how big your tables are, so that's a convenient thing. You can put comments in here. This is the first. Maybe we'll skip that one. We'll say that index 0 is the first item, because some of us don't like counting we don't like counting starting with 0. So hit enter. You can type in the comments. That might be useful to us if we're looking at the recipe editor down the line. So we can uncheck indices if we don't care about the last few elements of the table because we haven't used them. So maybe we're only going to grab indexes 0 through 14. And we could uncheck 0, actually, for that matter. So choose the data elements that you want to get from PAC control and click OK. So what's going on here, I don't think I really pointed out, but this is just like the text that you would see if you open up the recipe file in Notepad or Word. It looks just like this. This is the format. All right, I think this is the data that I want to record. Looks like enough data for me, so I'll go ahead and click OK. So I need to save this, and I'll call it my upload template. Recipes don't like spaces. I found that out the hard way, so I didn't seem to like the spaces. So I use an underscore there, and I'll save that file. So we've created the template, but just like with recipe downloads, we need to tell PAC Display, when do you want to apply that template? When do you want to get that data? And just like downloads, we can do it in one of two ways. We can use an animated graphic to launch the recipe upload, or we can use a trigger. So let's start with the animated graphic. I've got a button here I already drew that we'll use to store the persistent data. So my persistent variables, I want to record them in the file on my PC. So to configure this button, I'll double-click on the button. And this time under Operator-Driven Attributes, we're going to choose Upload Recipe. So I can either double-click on it or click Edit. And I need to enter a little bit more information. I need to tell PAC Display where my recipe template is located. So I'll browse for that. And again, I've stuck everything in the same directory to make it easy. So there's the file location. Now, once again, I have the choices of a fixed name or prompting for a name. So you have a lot of flexibility in how you do your recipe uploads and downloads. You can make one generic button, and the operator has to pick what data do I want to get and what do I want to call that file name. or as the programmer or developer, you can preset the buttons to get certain data or upload or download certain data. So for the template, we're going to make that fixed because we only have one template. We want it to be the upload template. And we'll keep the extension at RCP because that's how we named the file. So that specifies the data we're going to record. Now we need to say, where do you want to actually store those values? So we'll choose a directory. Doesn't have to be this directory. We could have another subdirectory that is our log data. But I'll just use the same directory and click OK. This time, I will choose prompt for name. This will let the operator enter a name of the data, perhaps the date and time, or maybe it's explaining what the test run is, or the situation. They might just call it backup of some sort. The operator will be able to choose the file name. Up until now, we've always used the RCP extension, but it doesn't have to be that way. We can use the .text extension as well, okay, or another one of your choice, but you probably want to stick with one of the two. So I'll choose to save it as a text file, and we have completed that configuration for that button. So let's go try it out. Go to File, Save Project, and Load Runtime. Okay, and we'll close that. Oh, I left my photo sensor on, so it launched that recipe. But let's check the upload recipe. Right now, my regular fuel low limit is 850 and 777. Maybe I'll change that just a little bit to get some new data. Okay, so now I'll click the button that we just configured to upload the recipe. And it's asking for the destination file to upload. So we're going to name that file. And I'll just call this My Data. And we set the default as a text file, so it'll create a mydata.txt file. And that's what the event log viewer tells us. It uploaded to the file mydata.txt using the format file, that upload template.recipe. So the event log viewer is very useful. Sometimes the first time you do a recipe, it may not work until you get everything exactly right. You get your file format exactly right. So the event log viewer is helpful. It's a nice confirmation that everything worked. I'll go ahead and close this. And I can now look at that file in Windows Explorer. Let me go and see it just created this mydata.txt file. Okay, so let's take a look at it. And it did indeed, it logged the file. The regular low limit value is 875. The premium low limit value is 850. And I recorded a table of integers that I have going that's a random table of integers. Okay. If I make a change, okay, I decide, hey, I want to store that data too. No problem. I click on the Upload Recipe button again. Maybe I'll call this My Data 2. And I've created a new file. I can go look at that recipes. That gets put in the same directory as the other ones. I'm storing it all in the same place. And my data is a little bit different. I've got the new value of my persistent variables and new values of this table as well. Okay. Now, one thing that's neat about these files is that we have used an upload to create, let me reopen that again, to create the those mydata.txt. Bear with me a second while I get those files up. So we've recorded those, and I said, well, these can really come in handy if you needed to upgrade the firmware, for example, or do anything that's going to erase the values of your persistent data. The nice thing is that once you've created the stored data, you can then re-download that exact same file to reinitialize the variables. So I've actually configured a button in my PAC Display to resend that data down there. So if I click on this button, I can choose one of those files that were uploaded, and now I'm going to download it. So if I choose the first one and click Open, okay, that reset my persistent variables to the first value that I used. If I want to restore it from the second batch of data, I can choose my data.txt, okay, and it reset it to the other values. Okay, so very useful to be able to quickly grab data and then send it back down to reset it or reinitialize it. Okay. Now, last thing that we need to do is we can have the upload be based on a trigger. And this trigger might be a tag reaching a certain value or a point turning on. Or another real-world example, maybe you want to store your persistent variables twice a day, just as a backup. Maybe these are your HVAC set points in the middle of the day and at night when the building is closed. So you might have a real-time clock going in PAC Control, and you set a variable true twice a day. Then PAC Control will use a recipe manager to watch for that variable to be true, and when that variable is true, the upload will occur. So let me show you how to upload based on an event or based on the value of a tag. So to do that, we'll go to Configure Recipes. And this time in the Recipe Manager, we're going to go to the Upload Recipes section. And we'll add a recipes, and it'll do the same thing our graphic launched recipe upload did, and it'll just store our persistent variable data. And once again, it's the same directory. We'll keep the fixed name because we only have one upload template that we want to use. And we can choose the same destination file. I know, not very creative, but it's practical. So we'll go with that. And we can prompt for the name and do a text file if we want to, or we could keep it RCP, not a problem. And just like the downloads, we'll specify what the trigger is going to be to launch the upload. So I'll select the trigger button, and I can then choose my tag. I'm going to use an integer variable that I set up in my strategy called the upload data flag. So from PAC Control, I will trigger this flag, and then that will cause PAC Display to grab my data. So I'm going to say if the value of that is greater than 0. Right now it is 0. So if that value is greater than 0, it will launch the recipe upload. Okay, so let's try that one out. We'll go to File, Save Project, and Load Runtime. Now to trigger that, I need to go to PAC Control and find my upload data flag. It's currently 0. Change it to 1 and click Apply. Close that. Now over in PAC Display, it started the upload process. And I can specify a destination file. Maybe I'll call this my data3. Okay? And I have recorded my data. So if I look in my recipes directory, I'll see I've got my data3.txt. Okay? So we can see that the data ran. Now that you've got it in a text file, you can save it for later use. Like I said, maybe re-download it back to the controller, to the strategy, or maybe you're going to take that data and import it into a spreadsheet or a database and save it. So that concludes the demo portion. We got done about 5 minutes early. And I'm going to go ahead now and take a look and see if we have any questions. I will just put my very last slide up there for you and share that with you. If this is something of interest to you and you want to kind of see this again or get more information, just go to our website at opto22.com and just type in Form 1702 in the search box. That will bring up the PAC Display User's Guide. It's got a great chapter on recipes, and you can find more details on specific checkboxes that I might not have covered. I will go through the questions in just a second, and you can always send us an email at optowebinar@opto22.com, or you can reach me directly at agray@opto22.com, and we'll be happy to answer any questions that we didn't get to. Let me just see if there are any questions. Now is your chance. If you don't have any questions, we really appreciate your time attending this. We do have another webinar scheduled for 2 weeks. It's a basic troubleshooting, kind of gives you a guideline of things that you can troubleshoot. And then 2 weeks from that, in about a month, then we're going to do Introduction to Opto Data Link, which is a database connectivity tool. Lets you log data to and from a database, to and from a PAC controller. If you're done, you can go ahead and close your screen and exit the webinar. It will bring up a poll, and we'd really appreciate your feedback. I see from the attendee list a lot of you are regulars, so you're used to this survey, but if you would answer it again, we would appreciate it. Let's see. Okay, Michael is asking, if you create a recipe with multiple tables using the text editor, can you edit it using the Edit Recipe option? That's a good question, Michael. I think if you do the validate and there was a problem, it would bring up the editing. But within editing utility, I think it might cause a problem because, I don't know, I really haven't tried that, Michael. I would have to just give it a try. Apologize for that, but maybe after the webinar I can give it a try and I will shoot you an answer. Let's see what else. Okay, any other questions? Going once, going twice. All right, thanks everybody for your time. I do appreciate it. And if you do think of any questions, feel free to send me an email. Thanks, and have a great day.